Hey guys, welcome to a new series in Planet Coaster. Short introduction to this series, I'm going to be making Jägerhorn Mountain Train, and the reason that I'm starting a new series is because, probably pretty obviously, the update 1.2 came out about a week ago now, probably even a little bit later, and we have some new stuff to play with, which is always awesome. So I want to take it back to pushing the envelope on what's possible in Planet Coaster, just try out different ideas, concept styles and themes. And one of those ideas, and this is an idea that I've had for a super long time, in fact I've had this idea since the first episode of Planet Coaster that I've ever made, is a mine train. Now you can go back to Grizzly Valley episode 1 to see that, and see how I epically failed by trying to build a mine train using B&M tracks and separate rocks, and it was horrible. But now, with the updates, we have some new things to play with, and I think this is the first time that we can actually take advantage of the in-game mechanics, whether they were meant to like that or not, to make a realistic mine train, in the sense that I am the biggest fan of these coasters. And that's the kind of mine train that's terrain conforming, very heavily themed, scenery all around it, the stuff like Big Thunder Mountain Railroad or Big Grizzly Mountain Runaway Minecarts, Expedition Everest, stuff like this. If you haven't noticed already, the trend for these coasters is also kind of to have an obnoxiously long and intricate name, hence also kind of the name of this series. But yeah, those coasters are really some of my favorite, since they have a lot of scenery interaction. They're really great at making these very interesting, picturesque sightlines, and all in all, they're so much more than just a simple roller coaster. They're just an entire experience. I really love those kinds of rides, and I've just been wanting to make one for a super long time in Planet Coaster. And the big game changer for me that made me decide to finally get this plan out of the old Grizzly Valley closet and do it really well for once was the fact that in the new update, as you might probably know because that's the biggest hype about the updates generally, we have collision detection being removed, and we don't really have to worry about coasters not being able to go through scenery or go through terraforming anymore, because they can now. Which means that you can actually build coasters through mountains and kind of sculpt the terraforming around the track to make sure that the track is always connected to the ground, which is one thing that you definitely want to have with this kind of coaster. And that's one of the things which I've definitely been waiting for as well. And the other thing is that you can just add scenery around coaster tracks without having to worry about the scenery being too close to the tracks. And this is pretty relevant for mine trains as well, since I want to get this in as realistically as possible, and I want to have catwalks and evacuation steps around the entire ride. So being able to actually place those things right next to the coaster track and get some extra scenery in that way is revolutionary. And this is one of the reasons why I think the removal of collision is really awesome. Not just because it allows me to build some of my favorite types of coasters, but just because it opens so many more options for having different kinds of scenery and coasters, but also terraforming and coasters, and also especially coasters and coasters interact with each other. And it's going to be really interesting to see that. But for this project, I'll just be working on a little mine train and mostly the terraforming and scenery around it. And in the first episode, we're really just working on getting the basic part of the layout done and making sure that we have all of the terraforming around that. So what's very interesting about this thing is that I actually spent many hours just trying to brainstorm what I wanted the layout to look like, actually for once, which is somewhat rare actually for me, sketching out ideas on paper and not really being happy with it all the time. So what you're looking at right now was the results of a lot of looking at different kinds of sightlines that I thought of and just going, no, that's not going to work, and a lot of being very mad at myself. But eventually I sort of found a layout that I was pretty happy with, because the sort of difficult thing that I wanted to get with this coaster was that I wanted to make it as small as possible, but at the same time look as large as possible and really look like a full-fledged alpine sort of area, which makes things a little bit hard. It's only a 20 meters tall coaster, so it's really not that big, and I didn't really want to make the hills that much larger either, especially if you compare it to Big Thunder Mountain Railroad or stuff like Expedition Everest especially. It's super small. But I still wanted to make this look like it was actually a full-fledged sort of alpine area in the Alps. And another thing was just sightlines in general are some of my favorite things, but also some of the hardest things to account for, since you just have to place things and kind of mess with the masses to actually see how buildings and terraforming and coaster tracks together are kind of gonna work to actually create good sightlines. So the major two sightlines that I wanted to worry about, I'll show off later in this video. Actually have a short real-time section for that. But it was pretty important for me to get the layout of this coaster right, hence why I took quite a bit of time for this episode. So the build-up of the layout is really, we have this one hill in the middle. I know that's probably not too much of a surprise, which is also going to house the major weenie, you could say, of the park, which is going to be a small sort of church just placed on top of that rock. And around that we have the coaster sort of twirling. We have two lift hills a little bit toward the back, so that the actual alpine landscape is more at the forefront from where you are at the paths, and the coaster sort of at a lower level going in front of the rocks. And what I was kind of hoping to do here, and this will probably hopefully also make a little bit more sense as I'm going through the park in real time, what I was kind of hoping to do here was to elevate the rocks and the back a little bit more by putting the tracks in front of it here. So you have that sort of build up of very low tracks, and then the rocks really dooming over those tracks as if they were actual mountains, which should hopefully make it look a little bit more tall. And another thing that's really going to help with that is that we're just going to have a trench which the coaster goes through as well, and that trench is just going to go in front of the mountain. So from the path you're kind of looking over from a valley onto the mountains, which should hopefully also help to make it look a little bit more impressive. The overall layouts of the coaster itself, aside from my sightline and terraforming reasons, was just inspired in general by Big Thunder Mountain and Big Grizzly, because those are really the best references you have for this kind of coaster. I thought of the idea that Big Grizzly has, where it kind of has these tunnels with multiple tracks going underneath or through a tunnel underneath a path. I thought that was a really interesting take on the mine train, so that was something I wanted to try with this one as well. And also we just kind of have those typical helixes that you see in, what's it called, the Seven Dwarfs mine train. Kind of have those kinds of helixes coming back as well, with some rockwork and foliage around it. So stuff like this helix which I'm building right now is definitely inspired by that. And then there are some general elements which are just almost cliches of the mine train at this point, like a bridge going over a small valley, or a sort of like a lift hill climbing up to the top of a mountain that I'll also have coming back in this layout. So it's somewhat of a mishmash in terms of inspiration. I think there are some parts which are very sort of traditional mine train-esque, but there are also some parts which look a lot more like Big Grizzly, which is a more modern kind of different take on the mine train. Although personally, Big Grizzly, I haven't been able to ride it, but from the looks of it, it looks to be my favorite. I'm a really big fan of how that ride works in general. It's a mine train with a regular lift hill, a backwards drop, and a launch. It's crazy. It's like all the mine trains combined. But anyway, those were my main sources of inspiration in terms of the layout and the terraforming. But I think there's a big difference that I wanted to make with this coaster. My initial idea was to literally just make a rip-off of Big Grizzly in Planet Coaster, but that just didn't feel right. So I wanted to try something else, and something that is probably very noticeable if you look at a lot of these mine trains is that they very typically have an American sort of theme to them. So Big Thunder Mountain obviously has an American theme to them. We have Big Grizzly, which I believe is somewhere in the Rocky Mountains or California-esque, something like that. And the same even goes for some non-mine train attractions which have the similar theme, like Big Grizzly River Run, or actually that was about it, or Splash Mountain, stuff like that. Now what you see very rarely on these mine trains is a theme that isn't that American sort of style theme. I guess the Seven Dwarfs mine train is different, but even then it's not the kind of theme that I wanted to try here, which is a European Alpine theme. More specifically, I want to go for a Swiss Chalet style, which is something that I've never tried myself, and hopefully it'll make things a bit more interesting, because the general European Alpine theme, as in southern Germany or Austria, is something that I've done before, and it just feels a bit boring, and it's been done many times before as well. But specifically the Swiss Chalet style is something that's very fancy and was very popular around the turn of the 19th, 20th century in Europe, and will be very interesting because it very much plays with intricate details while at the same time still carrying that very alpine look to it. So that's something that I want to play with to hopefully make this mine train, in terms of theme, very different from the existing mine trains out there. The one challenge that I guess it also does kind of give is that many of the mine trains, you'll notice, have very orange, brown, reddish rocks. Case in point is probably Big Thunder Mountain, which is just one big red peak. But even Big Grizzly and the other ones have very reddish rocks. Now, I was thinking for a while that I could build the mine train in the savanna biome in Planet Coaster, but that just doesn't really translate to the European theme well whatsoever. So that was pretty much very quickly scrapped, and all that's left is just the alpine biome itself. But the thing that kind of makes this biome very difficult is that it doesn't have a rock texture which carries the mine train rock texture. So mine trains in real life will just be made out of like concrete and stuff like that. They're all fake rocks, of course, so they definitely have that sort of beige-ish fake rock quality to them, and that's a quality that these rocks really don't have whatsoever. So it makes it quite difficult to make a mine train looking rock section with these. Not to mention that there's a lot of grass on this, and mine trains, well, they rarely ever have grass. It's just fake rocks and catwalks and a lot of wooden elements. So having those kinds of different textures in here is something that's a bit weird for the standard mine train that I'm basing this on. So that was at once is going to make this mine train a little bit more special and unique, but at the other hand, it's a little bit annoying to have to work with these textures. So I figured I can try to make the best of it, and one very interesting sort of inspiration that I took because of that is a general inspiration from miniature railroads, which probably sounds really weird because this is a theme park, and I definitely felt that as well. But it's a very interesting sort of case research into making alpine landscapes with fake rocks and with railroads going through them and all kinds of shrubbery. And actually I think it's surprisingly applicable, especially with shading rock structures and making textures right and getting all kinds of very small shrubbery in. So the main inspiration here in the end, even though the ride concept itself was based on the fact that I really wanted to make a Disney-esque mine train, the general look of this is inspired by miniature railroads. And that's also kind of what this thing is, because I'm trying to build it in such a way that it seems a lot larger than it actually is, because this is really just kiddie coaster sized stuff. So yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. And going back into what I'm actually building here, this is the start of making the catwalks. Just as a fair warning, the majority of this video until the end is gonna feature quite a bit of making catwalks, but also some rock work and some foliage work. The thing is, this is technically a Vekoma mine train, and even though I've been ignoring that part of the equation until this point, it's a very important thing to me as well, because I'm just a sucker for Vekoma mine trains, but also this is the typical mine train that Disney uses. Like, they're pretty much exclusively all Vekomas, I think. And what they do for some reason, and I don't really have a source on this specifically, but from what I've heard from Free the Bear, at least he told me that they have evacuation points every 100 meters, at least something like this. Basically what you'll notice is if you go to any Vekoma mine train, you'll see catwalks alongside the entire ride, and sort of very sneakily hidden away all over places like the Seven Dwarfs mine train. There are like these little steps going to the regular paths for evacuation purposes. So you pretty much at every single point of the ride, would it stop there, you could just get out of the car and walk away and get to the nearest little evacuation steps. So that's very interesting, but it also makes it pretty hard to faithfully recreate this in Planet Coaster, because I really just wanted to make sure that I had all of these catwalks recreated as well. And obviously these aren't just functional catwalks, like they're following the tracks wherever they go. So I really wanted to try my best to make these catwalks blend in a little bit and actually have them add to the look of the ride instead of making everything look dull and annoying with all of those catwalks. So I'm really trying to go with the materials, the kind of dark wooden materials that you would find around here as much as I can. But also it's just a little bit difficult because you have to follow the coaster curves everywhere, which isn't always the most fun thing to do. But in the end it's gonna be looking hopefully pretty cool. At least I'm quite a fan of how it turned out in the end of this episode already. Now some other stuff that I wanted to do as some general detailing is just throwing some rocks around, especially some of those very small pebbles, just sinking rocks into the ground to make those little pebbles here and there, which is pretty funny because it adds that little bit of detailing that you don't really notice too much, but it just adds to the overall texture and look of the mountain, I think. And along with that, and this is something that I've been experimenting with for a while and I just haven't been able to get it to work too well on anything, but here I think it actually works quite well, is putting bushes upside down. Now this might probably need a little bit of explanation. Basically, because of the way that the textures work in Planet Coaster, if you turn a bush upside down, it's also gonna like reverse the lighting, so you're actually gonna get shadowed bushes, or I'm not sure if that's a good way to explain it. In any case, if you put bushes upside down, they're going to be darker. Now, it really depends on how the bush is modeled, whether it's actually going to happen, or how much darker the bush is going to turn. But there are some bushes that turn a little bit darker, and there are some bushes that turn into like almost black when you turn them upside down. And it can be very annoying at times, because you also have like these trunks coming from the bottom of bushes, which are now coming to the top, so it's hard to place those things. But I wanted to try and mess with upside down bushes as much and wherever I could, because it's something that adds, I think, to the alpine look of the coaster. Many of the bushes that are in game are sort of tropical and have very light textures, but I wanted to make sure that I had all kinds of very dark alpine-esque bushes on this ride. So a lot of the bushes are actually placed upside down, and this was just my first sort of public experimenting with this thing. I've posted some stuff on Twitter about it, but this is the first time that I've ever done it on YouTube, and I'm actually pretty happy with how it looks. Especially some of those bigger bushes. I can't remember the name. Let me actually look that up for a second. I know for a fact the jungle bushes, the green bush and the forest bush. That's it. Those two are actually very well put upside down because they don't turn too dark. And they do have a small, like, little stem, but you can hide those inside of rocks or the side of whatever. So that just works pretty well. So a lot of the bushes in here are those. But there are also some other ones that work out upside down quite well. And also some bushes are technically trees. But hey, that's a pretty old method at this point. I just really like how some of these smaller trees that do have these darker textures look when you sink them into the ground until they're just a small little bush, and use those as detailing, because truth be told, there aren't too many foliage options in the game, so anything that you can do to add like more variation to the foliage is something that I really want to make use of. What's also interesting is I'm actually using the swamp trees as pines here. The thing is just, for me personally, I don't think the pine trees fit in too well with the rest of the trees, at least not what we have right now, and definitely not the look of the very rugged brownish mountain that we have for the coaster right now. So I ended up using the swamp trees as pine trees instead, because I think they actually do look somewhat like pine trees, especially if you put them into this context of, you know, this being a mountain somewhere in Europe and give it that very alpine feel. I think it can work out pretty well. So a lot of the pine trees are actually not pine trees at all, but they're just the forest tree. So we have that going on as well. And yeah, that's pretty much all of the foliage stuff. Except one thing that I still kind of wanted to mention. The two flowers are now recolorable, which weren't recolorable before. And I'm talking about the white floral bush and the yellow floral bush, which used to be just white and yellow with you not being able to change it at all. But now you can actually recolor these things, and while this is awesome for any kinds of flower beds, because there are actually some extra flowers, which is really cool because I'm a big fan of flowers, but it's not just handy for that kind of stuff. The thing is, you could even recolor them to the color that the leaves already have. So technically, if you take for instance the white floral bush and just make those white flowers the same green that the rest of the bush is already, you just have one extra bush to play with. So that's one thing that I'm also playing with here. Another thing that I was kind of trying for a little bit was using the fairy tale columns as a way to get some catwalks in here, but that didn't really work. So what I ended up using, just because they have the perfect footprint and texture, is the underside of a fountain. And I'm well aware that this might eventually crash the game, or at least it's not very good for the frame rate, because the game is technically rendering all of those water animations that you don't really see in the first place, and these are really a shit ton of fountains. But I just really like the look of these fountains way too much not to use them as catwalks. The only other downside, no pun intended, is that you do have to make sure that they follow the course of the track, and you really have to place every single step separately, and it takes quite a bit of trial and error to make sure that everything is actually connecting and is actually the right distance from the tracks. So yeah, this was at times pretty difficult to actually pull off, or at least it took quite a bit of patience. But I think it's worth it. For the final look of the ride, we have those neat catwalks running around the entire track, and I think it also just adds to the general look of the railroad. And that was really my most important thing, like just having the track alone, it really looks bare, so I wanted to make sure that the steps looked in such a way that they kind of add to the railroad tracks. And yeah, if I'm gonna have to put some fountains upside down to achieve that, I'll just put those fountains upside down and deal with the lag later on, because this just looks way too good to pass out on it. Now, in a similar vein, I also wanted to have some variations of the different scenery that's around the ride, and while you won't see too much of that today, in this episode at least, there is a little bit of it, among which those lanterns which I'm building, which are just a really small addition, but I do want to have lanterns around the entire ride eventually. And there will be also some random clutter like barrels and all kinds of, I don't know what, all kinds of wooden stuff around the mountain to make it look like it's actually alive. And very similarly, I wanted fences around the catwalks as well, because, you know, safety regulations, but also it just looks pretty swell. And as for the fences, I'm just super happy that Frontier added some fences that we can play with, not just as fences, like you've probably noticed that I've also already used them as catwalks because their textures are just way too good not to use them as different things, but as fences as well. It's just, I think it's generally best to have as many variations of fences as you can within any given area, so having all kinds of the same fence is just a little bit boring, and actually being able to mix up textures and colors and all kinds of shapes of fences together in one area, I think makes things a lot more interesting, hence also why I am like changing up the catwalks that I use, or the catwalks fences that I use all the time here, to get a slightly unique look to every single part of the coaster. Now here I opened up this little mountain that I had, and the reason for that was kind of because I saw a new chance for a sightline, and I figured I should just do it. This is also going to be the thumbnail, so this is a little bit of thumbnail preparation in a sense. Because looking from this area over that little pond that we have in the middle of the helix toward the big mountain is already one of my favorite shots on the coaster, and as always, I just also really want to make sure that I'm building the coaster from the idea of a couple of really important points where I want to look at the coaster from. And I think this is something to always keep in mind. A bit like a painting, that you want to take your distance and see how the entire thing is looking, but also in a similar sense, there are some certain points from which you're going to be able to look at the coaster, so you really want to make sure that from those points you have the best possible sightlines. And this was one of those points, not just because it works out quite well for the thumbnail, stuff like that, but also because on the other side of the trench I'm planning to have some sort of restaurant or something. So this will be a really good view to enjoy from there as well. So I wanted to make sure that this was quite open and we had some rocky stuff going on there instead of a big hill with all kinds of foresting going on. And finally, I just wanted to work on some of the foliage detailing around the area, add some more bushes and trees because it was looking a little bit bare. This is very heavy on the gardening, by the way. The reason why this would realistically only be a Disney ride, because only Disney can afford to do that. But yeah, that's basically it for the time-lapse, so I'm gonna jump into my real-time self and show off this coaster for a little bit. Alright, so here we are in game. I did a little bit more work on the track down here, but it's not too much. And overall, this is just a sort of prototype of how the rest of the ride is going to look. Here's that little sightline, by the way. I'm still a really big fan of how this is working out so far. And as for the layout, it's not entirely finished, and we have this that I still have to carve away, so this part is basically finished. But after this, and this is something that I haven't really mentioned yet, it's just going to drop down and do some stuff down here. The station is also going to be moved, because this is not the place where I'm planning to have the station in the end. But this is the most important part of the layout, and these are also the main two sightlines that I wanted to show. We've got this one down here from the path, because that's obviously where you're going to be able to look at the coaster from, with the helix interacting here. This is going to be a bridge, so there's going to be quite a bit of detailing work in there as well. And then over here, this is all kept empty for the final weenie, which is going to be a small church with an onion spire, according to the plans, and according to my awful sketches. So that should work out pretty well, hopefully. And the second sightline that's pretty important here is from the path. And I'm actually pretty happy with how this thing looks so far. It really does look like it's kind of, you know, a proper mountain, even though this is just a couple meters high. And I do kind of like the effect that having this sort of trench in between the paths and the coaster has. Though there's one thing that will still hopefully add to this, and that is actually being able to have a bridge here, some foliage in here, and some foliage in here to really sort of frame the sightline even, and just give something very fancy to look at in the tower here, which will hopefully also be a little bit taller, because right now the tallest thing of the entire ride is the lift hill, which are about equally tall, which are just 20 meters tall. It's really low. But yeah, this is basically how the coaster is looking at the moment, and I hope to finish the rest of the coaster in a similar vein. But there was something that I still wanted to show off, because there's a little trick that I've been messing with where I'm not sure if I'm really going to use it, because I like this coaster being a train, but there's a way to get a different kind of train on it in a way that I really like, because it's basically the big Grizzly kind of train. All you really have to do is test the ride after removing part of the track, and then remove that track and edit again. And by doing that, make sure that your front car is gone. And surprisingly, this actually looks really good. Like, these are mine carts that look very similar to the cars of Big Grizzly. What is it? Big Grizzly Mountain Runaway mine carts. There we go. They're very similar. In fact, they're similar to lots of different kinds of coaster cars. And I really like the look that this thing has. It's just, I'm not sure if I want it to not be a train, because it works out really well as a train. So that's quite a difficult thing. By the way, I think I will give it a very quick POV, just to give you a general idea of what this is going to look like. Be aware though that this is extremely work in progress, and areas like these are very unfinished. But this is about the final version of the track, at least for this part of the track. So here we're going over the bridge at a pretty decent speed. Do remember that this is a kiddie coaster, so we're not going to do anything ridiculous. It's really about going through the scenery. Over the helix over here, which is probably already my favorite part of the ride. And into a double down, which isn't even, at least for such a small part, it isn't too Vekoma-ish, but it seems really fun. It's quite similar actually to some parts of Big Grizzly. And here's a double up, but I'm probably going to remove that because it feels a little bit too awkward. Like, it's not something that I think Vekoma would do in that position. I mean, it would be something that I would do, but I'm still on the fence about that one. And then we're gonna get into the lift hill. There are some leaves to remove over there, and pretty much drop to our doom. By the way, the idea here is that by all plans, this is the final brake run already, and we'll have the station area in here. We're gonna have the path kind of go down underneath the lift hill here, have some interesting bridge aesthetics going on, and by having a large drop here, which like goes straight through the middle of this helix, but also kind of builds against the hill, I'm hoping to make this drop look very large and impressive, even though it drops down from a height of 20 meters and might go under the ground a little bit. It's gonna be a pretty intense kind of thing. I think pretty similar to how much people generally like the drop on Expedition Everest, which is quite a sizable drop as well. Not to say that this drop isn't already quite large. I just don't want to make the coaster too extreme, while at the same time making it look as extreme as I can, if that makes any sense. But yeah, that's basically the ride for now. In the next episode, I'm gonna do some interesting detailing around these parts, hopefully finish up more of this area, and maybe get to the station, although I'm not quite sure about that. No, I don't think I'll get to the station, but hopefully get to the weenie, get to the small church that's gonna stand on this hill over here, and really, what's the word that I'm looking for? I guess solidify the look of the coaster. I mean, this is a general impression of how I want everything to look like, but obviously it's not really quite there yet, so we'll see how it's gonna look with the buildings and the more intricate scenery in place. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.